The only American soldier to fight for Russia's Red Army.
Joseph Robert Barrel was a paratrooper with the 101st Airborne when he was caught by the Germans during the Normandy landings. Eventually, he managed to escape and wandered in the German countryside until he met Russian troops and persuaded their commanders to allow him to fight on the front line. He fought for a month and was wounded. Marshal Zhukov arranged for Barrel's trip back to the U.S. Barrel is the only American who fought the Germans in both the U.S. and Red Armies during World War II. Upon his enlistment, Barrel chose to become a paratrooper, joining the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Screaming Eagles Division. Specializing in radio communications and demolition, he was stationed in Ramsbury, England, to prepare for the upcoming Allied invasion from the west. After 9 months of training, Barrel completed 2 missions and occupied France in April and May of 1944, delivering gold to the French resistance. On June 6, what would become known as D-Day, Barrel's C-47 came under enemy fire over the Normandy coast, and he was forced to jump from the exceedingly low altitude of 120 meters. After landing in Saint-Côme-du-Mont, Sergeant Barrel lost contact with his fellow paratroopers, but succeeded in blowing up a power station. He performed other sabotage missions before being captured by German soldiers a few days later. Over the next 7 months, Barrel was held in 7 different German prisons. He escaped twice, only to be recaptured each time. Barrel and his fellow prisoners had been hoping to find the Red Army, which was a short distance away. After the second escape, in which he and his companions set out for Poland, but boarded a train to Berlin by mistake, Barrel was turned over to the Gestapo by the German civilian. Beaten and tortured, he was released to the German military after officials stepped in and determined that the Gestapo had no jurisdiction over prisoners of war. The Gestapo were about to shoot Barrel and his comrades, claiming that he was an American spy who had parachuted into Berlin. Barrel was then taken to the Stalag 3C POW camp in Alt-Druwitz, from which he escaped in early January 1945. He headed east, hoping to meet up with the Soviet army, encountering a Soviet tank brigade in the middle of January. He raised his hands, holding a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, and shouted in Russian, "American, comrade!" Barrel was eventually able to persuade the battalion's commander, Alexandra Samosenko, allegedly the only female tank officer of that rank in the war, to allow him to fight alongside the unit on its way to Berlin, thus beginning his month-long stint in a Soviet tank battalion, where his demolitions expertise was much appreciated. Barrel's new battalion was the one that freed his former camp, Stalag 3C, at the end of January. But in the first week of February, he was wounded during an attack by German Stuka dive bombers. He was evacuated to a Soviet hospital in Landsberg, where he received a visit from Soviet Marshal Grigory Zhukov, who, intrigued by the only non-Soviet in the hospital, learned his story through an interpreter and provided Barrel with official papers in order to rejoin American forces. Joining a Soviet military convoy, Barrel arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in February of 1945, only to learn that he had been reported by the U.S. War Department as killed in action on June 10, 1944, on French soil. A funeral mass had been held in his honor in Muskegon, and his obituary was published in the local newspaper. The embassy officers in Moscow were unsure of his story, so they placed him under Marine Guard in the Metropole Hotel until his identity was established through his fingerprints. Barrel returned home to Michigan on April 21st, 1945, and celebrated VE Day 2 weeks later in Chicago. He was married to Joanne Hollowell in 1946, coincidentally in the same church and by the same priest who had held the funeral mass 2 years earlier. Barrel worked for Brunswick Corporation for 28 years, retiring as a shipping supervisor. Barrel died in his sleep of heart failure on December 12, 2004. He was 81 years old. Remember, if it's more interesting, you can find it here. Thanks.